Science is clear. We need a global transformation to decarbonize future for a safe, stable climate. But science is equally clear. We need a global transformation to sustainable development to stand a chance on the climate agenda. In fact, 3 new key scientific insights show clearly that we need to have a system-wide perspective if we're serious about prosperity for 10 billion co-citizens, all with the right to development on our planet. It's a people's planet agenda. And the first scientific insight in this new science is, in fact, that we are now, for the first time, able to define the desired necessary state to support prosperity on Earth. We can define scientifically the Garden of Eden. And this data comes, not surprisingly, some ice core data. What you see on this graph is the last 100,000 years. It's a perfect timing, in fact, because we've been modern humans during this entire period with the same ability to develop societies as we know it. It was, as you see on the y-axis, showing temperature variability, a good proxy of how it was to live on Earth, a very jumpy ride indeed for humanity. We were just hunters and gatherers, just a few million people having a very rough time in this extraordinarily jumpy, variable future or history. I can tell you we had 5-10 degrees Celsius variability over just 5-10 years. At a cold spot, we were down to 15,000 adults left on Earth. And then we leave this extraordinary variability and we enter the latest era that we've learned to call the Holocene. And it's an extraordinarily stable period on Earth, and we barely enter it, and we do the most important invention of all our inventions. We invent agriculture, which becomes the starting point for our differentiation and modern civilizational journey. And based on this, we're now exiting this point in a journey which is now the drama. What you see here is actually the story of what is threatening the Holocene. And it starts in 1750 in the United Kingdom with the Industrial Revolution, the fossil fuel revolution that expands innovation, expands invention through railway trade, and when you see the antibiotic revolution taking form together with the Haber-Bosch process enabling modern agriculture. But as you see, we have basically no impact on the planet as a whole. We're still just a few billion people, up until the point when you see that we come to 10 years after the Second World War, 1950, which is the point that science today defines as the moment of the great acceleration. This is the moment when we start really expanding our pressure on the planet. Now I see that you're not even, there we are. Sorry, the slides are going in the wrong direction here. So what you're seeing now is this journey of humanity on Earth. It starts 250 years ago. It starts with the Industrial Revolution. It starts with the fossil fuel era and the invention of technologies which spend and spread very quickly across the world and enables us to go into our modern civilization, benefiting predominantly the rich minority. We have very limited impact as the few we are, despite this evolution on the planetary scale. We invent antibiotics, fertilizers, expand modern agriculture. We enter, in fact, the great mass extinction of biodiversity. We now start polluting the atmosphere. But it's not until 1950, which you see here, which is the takeoff point of the great acceleration of the human enterprise. This is now when we exponentially rise in our pressures. The warnings come early, in fact. In 1960, we have the silent spring. We have the limits to growth debate in the 1970s. But still, the planet is so resilient, it can take our pressures. We can abuse biodiversity, overfishing, deforestation, and emission of greenhouse gases. It's not until right at this point, in the mid-1980s, that science observes for the first time that we're threatening the stratospheric ozone layer, and policy responds, and we become planetary stewards. And then comes 1990, which is a dramatic point for science, because now is the first time we observed sudden, abrupt changes. We can actually see lake systems tipping over, ecosystems tipping over, cod fisheries outside of Newfoundland collapsing, accelerated ice melt. We seem to come to a point of saturation for the first time, and science is clear. From the 1990s onwards, we enter a new domain. Dear friends, welcome to the Anthropocene, where we as humanity are the dominating driving force of change at the planetary scale. We're now the dominant pressure point on the planet as a whole, and we're seeing invoices coming back from the Earth system right back to our societies. And this is something we've never seen before, and it occurs over just the last 25, 30 years. The resilience of the planet is now, so to say, coming to the end point, and the message is really clear from science that we have gone in a very short period of time from being a small world on a big planet to today, in fact, having become a big world on a small planet. Now the question is, how does the planet respond? Well, it doesn't respond linearly, as was in the way we built up our economies, assuming that we have limited impacts coming back. In fact, science is clear on the second insight that the planet responds in a nonlinear way. Tipping points and resilience is absolutely key. From rainforest systems can tip over to savannas, to the abrupt potential shifts we're seeing in Antarctica, where science now indicates that we may have crossed the tipping point of irreversible melt of glaciers that could actually commit ourselves to another 1 meter sea level rise irreversibly. We see the science being clear that ice melt is now coming to a point that if we burn the remaining fossil fuels, we could actually commit ourselves to 58 meter sea level rise on the planet. We know, in fact, that tipping points are clear here. When ice melts, the planet gets darker, and we could actually pop up from 2 degrees Celsius to a dramatic 4 degrees Celsius in one go. This is where resilience is key, to recognize that now we need to manage resilience. But it's not only about nature, it's also about humans. And we're starting to see the first indications that abrupt ecological change actually interacts and cannot be decoupled from dramatic, catastrophic human disasters, such as the war in Syria, which was preceded, science now shows, by the worst drought ever recorded in Syria over the last 8,000 years. Over 1 million rural people were pushed into cities like Aleppo and Damascus, and we can no longer decouple the social, ecological surprises we're seeing in our world. So we must understand that we now need to really face the reality that the planet cannot be negotiated with. This is data, again, on glacial changes, but now over the last 20,000 years. What you see on the y-axis is average temperature on Earth from -4, deep ice age, up until +4, a place we haven't been for the past 4 million years. We exit the ice age, and then we enter our Eden's Garden, this miraculous period that enabled us to actually develop our modern societies. And look here at the safe corridor, the sweet spot we've been in. We've been in a ±1 degree Celsius world that has enabled modern societies to develop. And we're following, as you see, this dramatic path that takes us on average, with no action, to 4 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. We're at this 1 degree ceiling, a place we've never been before already now when we meet in Paris. But let's take this data and look at what science says in terms of the negotiation with the planet. Here is the 2 degree ceiling, the limit, the planetary guardrail that we're discussing in Paris. And what you see is the latest science on what are the tipping points that we could induce if we go too far on climate. And what you see is that coral reefs, science now tells us, is actually going to collapse before 2 degrees Celsius. You see that Arctic sea ice is actually threatened the same level. Greenland is actually potentially crossing a tipping point at already 2-3 degrees Celsius, committing us to 6-7 meters sea level rise. You have the East Antarctic ice shelf. You have permafrost thawing that would be a tipping point that would self-reinforce warming. These are warning signals of biophysical stop signs for humanity that cannot be negotiated with. And as you see to the right is the pathways we're threatened with if we continue without action. So this tells us, dear friends, that we really need to do everything we can to stay within the 2 degrees Celsius guardrail to stand a chance to avoid self-reinforced kickoffs into the future. So our 3 insights are the following from science and the key message on an action day. The first is the Holocene is our only state that we know that can support human prosperity in the future. We need to stay within the Holocene. The second is that the Anthropocene is where we are. Welcome there. We're in the driving seat. We are now the dominant force on the planet. The third is that tipping points can no longer be excluded. If you combine these 3, you'll end up with a new paradigm for development, which is the scientific contribution that we need to define a safe operating space within planetary boundaries to be able to support human future. Climate is therefore set in an integrated systems perspective of also safeguarding biodiversity, fresh water, land, nitrogen, phosphorus, air pollution, and that these are like three musketeers, one for all, one for everyone, and that a future within a safe operating space is also an equitable future. In fact, the final battleground to succeed on climate is actually to be able to be sustainable stewards of our biosphere, because that is the biggest carbon sink for our emission of greenhouse gases, 55%, and one of them being in the ocean, which is a massive resilience parameter for the planet. But remember, it has a huge cost of heat in the ocean, but also of acidification, which, as you see in this slide, may actually push the biological life in the oceans across tipping points, because we're breaking up calcium carbonate, which is the biological building block for all marine life. It actually means, as Ségolène Royal pointed out, we need to become planetary stewards. And science is clear on this point. Every finance minister, every prime minister in any nation must now be equally concerned about the resilience of any biosphere system on the planet, because it regulates the resilience of the entire planet. We need to transition our thinking on sustainable development from our current three-level pillar system, which we've got used to, which is about economic, social, and ecological development, and recognize it has simply not worked. We have ended up in what we can call a Mickey Mouse economy, with the economy growing at the expense of human capital and natural capital. It argues here in Paris we need a transition to a future where the economy delivers on social aspirations within science-based, policy-defined global environmental targets. And in fact, our Sustainable Development Goals paradigm, now endorsed by world leaders, is the first example of people succeeding to reach aspirations within planetary boundaries. We have goals for climate, water, biodiversity, and oceans, and we're actually tipping the world towards this logic. Science, to close, has stepped up to this challenge, provided Paris with a very clear message. We need, therefore, to stay under the 2-degree absolute planetary limit, which is the #1 target. It translates to a global carbon budget. We have no more than 1 trillion tons to emit. It gives us another 25 years in a fossil fuel-driven economy in the world. It means a transition towards a zero-emissions future on this planet, the only way to have a safe prosperity for humanity. And interestingly, it shows, as was pointed out on this panel, that we now have so much evidence that transformations can actually not be done, but also generate benefits for human well-being and be actually a transition that can accelerate in the future, because it can actually be combined with good action for benefits on the future. We have, as scientists, been almost shocked by the enormous support by fellow co-citizens in the world on this science message to Paris. We have done a global campaign with selfies making Earth statements that the New York Times will now be publishing during this week. This happens to be the selfie I did with Naomi Klein just the other day on a public event. And it kind of translates to the very positive and constructive translation of the scientific risk, that now is the time to leave our children nothing. We now have the great task of zero poverty, zero carbon emissions, and zero biodiversity loss, and that these zeros is, as science is very clear, the pathway towards a prosperous, stable, resilient future on our small planet for our thriving big world. Thank you very much.